Everyone Saranai, blessings of the Triple Gem. Welcome to our full moon Poya Dhamma session. Heartfelt good wishes to everyone on this Uposatha day. The title for today's Dhamma session is The Attributes of Household Life That Can Poison the Mind. So we will be delving into the Cuḻadukkhakkhandha Sutta. So this is Majjhima Nikaya, discourse number 14. In this particular discourse, Mahānāma the Sakyan asked the Buddha why, despite understanding the Dhamma taught by him, his mind gets invaded by states of greed, hatred, and delusion at times, and those states remain in the mind. So it refers to attributes of household life that contribute to a certain internal state that remains unabandoned in us. So causing greed, hatred, and delusion to enter and remain in our minds. And more on that later. So the Buddha reminds us of the importance of seclusion from sensual pleasures and unwholesome states as the means to protect the mind. And we'll elaborate on this. So let's begin. Let's begin by paying homage to the Triple Gem. We can Anjali and bow our heads. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dhamma, and homage to the Noble Sangha. So let's have a quick look at what we'll cover in this session. We'll go through our usual tips and reminders, some things that will help us to get the most out of this session today. An overview of the sutta that we're looking at today, the Cuḻadukkhakkhandha Sutta. We'll also look at who is Mahānāma the Sakyan, so we get the context for who's receiving the teaching from the Buddha. And we'll deep dive straight into Buddha's answer to Mahānāma and the teaching on the gratification and dangers of sensual pleasures. And the last part of the sutta is actually Buddha giving an account about his encounter with the Nigaṇṭhas, and it fits very nicely in. Once we get to the end of the sutta, it will all make sense. And then we'll have questions and answers and share the merit and the blessings at the end. So tips and reminders, keep an open mind. Of course, when we hear the Buddha's teaching, sometimes there's things that we've heard before. There's also other times where it's new or it's connecting to things that we've maybe not understood before. So keeping an open mind helps to ensure that we cultivate the right view and not veer off the noble path. So be okay with not understanding everything. We do get frustrated when we don't understand the Buddha's teachings, and it's an ongoing challenge until we realize Nibbana. But our spiritual faculties will sharpen. So it becomes possible for us to make gradual progress. And for that reason, it's good to be okay with not understanding everything. Whatever we understand, maybe that's what's needed right now. And we are all learners. We're trainees, learners, sekhas, developing this Noble Eightfold Path out of the whole mass of suffering. So we help each other as Kalyana Mitras, good friends, to go together on this path. So we apply ourselves to the meditation. We use our own examples, especially when we hear the Buddha's words, and we have good wishes for everybody. And we start from a place of gratitude, particularly for the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, the noble ones in the pure abodes, the Suddhabhasa, and all our friends, family, teachers, guides, and people who help and support us to walk this noble path, including those on the Zoom session today. So we go together. So the overview for this sutta is really that Mahānāma, he's a relative and lay disciple of the Buddha. He's puzzled by how his mind is still troubled at times by greedy and hateful deluded thoughts, despite understanding the Buddha's teaching. And he asks the Buddha if there's a state that is unabandoned internally that is causing this. And the Buddha points to an unabandoned internal state connected with living a household life and being enticed by sensual pleasures. Therefore, at times, greed, hatred, and delusion invade and remain in the mind. Only when we're secluded from sensual pleasures and unwholesome states, when we attain to the mental absorption, so the jhanas, then we are unaffected by sensual pleasures. So he gives a teaching to Mahānāma on the gratification and dangers in sensual pleasures. And he explains how they affect and trouble the mind. And that's what we'll spend the most part of this session on. The Buddha ends with this account about the Nigaṇṭhas. And what they were doing was they were performing austerities and ascetic practices. And so the Buddha goes and questions them and corrects their view. And there's something to be learned in that account. And that's why he's included it in terms of explaining it to Mahānāma. So who is Mahānāma the Sakyan? He's a Sakyan prince, an elder brother of Venerable Anuruddha and cousin of the Buddha. He's a devoted follower of the Buddha, and he received many teachings, and a lot of them are very, very helpful, particularly for lay people, lay followers, and trainees. So an example is the Sekha-patipada Sutta. So that's Majjhima Nikaya Discourse number 53. If you remember, that teaching is where the Buddha asked Venerable Ananda about giving a teaching to the Sakyans about the trainee's mode of progress. So we've been through parts of that before. There's also the Paṭhamamahānāma Sutta in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 11, discourse number 11. And this is where he asked the Buddha about how one should practice given lay people's busy lives. And the Buddha encourages becoming grounded in the 5 spiritual faculties and then developing further recollections on the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, one's own virtue, one's own generosity, and also the devas. And then another example is the Mahānāma Suttas in the chapter on stream entry. And the Buddha allays Mahānāma's fears about dying unmindfully and being reborn in a bad destination. And he assures him that he will definitely go to a good place since he's long developed the mind and he has the 4 factors of stream entry. So Mahānāma was declared by the Buddha as the foremost male lay follower among donors who give what is excellent. So just as an aside, it's probably a very good idea to do a session on Mahānāma as a role model. So we know by the end of his life, Mahānāma had attained path and fruit of once return, but it's unclear at the time of this teaching if he was attained. He may have already attained to stream entry, Sotapanna, or even to once return, Sakadagami. So let's go straight into the discourse. It opens, "Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was living in the Sakyan country at Cūḷadukkhakkhandha in Nigaṇṭhas Park. Then Mahānāma the Sakyan went to the Blessed One, and after paying homage to him, he sat down at one side and said, 'Venerable Sir, I have long understood the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One thus. Greed is an imperfection that defiles the mind. Hate is an imperfection that defiles the mind. Delusion is an imperfection that defiles the mind. Yet while I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One thus, at times states of greed, hate, and delusion invade my mind and remain. I have wondered, Venerable Sir, what state is still unabandoned by me internally, owing to which at times these states of greed, hate, and delusion invade my mind and remain?' And so the Buddha answers, 'Mahānāma, there is still a state unabandoned by you internally, owing to which at times these states of greed, hatred, and delusion invade your mind and remain. For were that state already abandoned by you internally, you would not be living a household life or a home life. You would not be enjoying sensual pleasures. It is because that state is unabandoned by you internally that you are living the home life and enjoying sensual pleasures.' So what we can understand from this opening dialogue between Mahānāma and the Buddha is that Mahānāma knows that lobha, dosa, moha, greed, hatred, and delusion are imperfections. They defile the mind. They poison the mind. But although he understands that, he asks why his mind is still polluted at times and those states remain in his mind. And so he asks the question, what is it internally that I haven't maybe abandoned? And the Buddha affirms that there is a state. And what he's confirming is that it's connected with living a household life and enjoying sensual pleasures. So he makes the point that if Mahānāma had already internally abandoned that state, then he wouldn't remain living a household life, enjoying sensual pleasures. So the Buddha is clearly highlighting the attributes of household life. They go hand in hand with enjoying sensual pleasures. When we think there is pleasure to be gained, and we're tempted by sensual pleasures, defilements rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion, they can poison the mind, and then also our verbal and bodily conduct as well. Now, in this life, the body we have is the result of past actions. It's the vipaka karma. And we've spoken about this before. We desired or craved sensory experiences. We wanted to see forms, could be in our relatives, or to see different beautiful things, to hear sounds, to smell odors, to taste flavors, and experience tactile sensations, thinking it's better like this. That's our conceit that kicks in. And it was the taint of existence, bhavasava, that said, I need an eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind in order to enjoy sensual pleasures. So we've come into the human birth seeking pleasure. As we've mentioned before, we're built to be pleasure seekers. So living this household life has all the characteristics or attributes for pleasure seeking. It's the fertile ground for sensual pleasures and unwholesome states that are rooted in the greed, hate, and delusion, because we live in very close proximity to sensual objects. And so we need to keep activating the Noble Eightfold Path, and to get the right concentration, which means the jhanas, the minimum is the first jhana, because otherwise we're tempted by sensuality. And just because we've reached jhanas before, or even formless attainment, or even the cessation of perception and feeling before, it doesn't mean we can't be tempted, because we're not in those states all the time living a household life. So the Buddha then goes on to tell Mahānāma, even though a noble disciple has seen clearly as it actually is with proper wisdom, how sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering, and much despair, and how great is the danger in them, as long as he still does not attain to the rapture and pleasure that are apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, or to something more peaceful than that, he may still be attracted to sensual pleasures. So the wording here is very much like when the Buddha talks about attaining to the jhanas. But when a noble disciple has seen clearly as it actually is with proper wisdom, how sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering, and much despair, and how great is the danger in them, and he attains to the rapture and pleasure that are apart from sensual pleasures, so secluded from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, or to something more peaceful than that, then he is no longer attracted or enticed by sensual pleasures. So here the Buddha mentions how a noble disciple understands with wisdom the truth about sensual pleasures. So that wisdom is sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering, much despair, and how great the danger in them is. In Pali, this is apasada, so little gratification, bahu dukkha, much suffering, bahu upayasa, much despair, adinava, so danger. And in other words, a noble disciple has seen clearly as it really is by contemplating the Buddha's words in the Ānenjasappaya Sutta. So this is Majjhima Nikāya discourse number 106. Some of you will know this, that sensual pleasures the Buddha teaches and asks us to contemplate, they're impermanent, so they don't last. They're hollow, false, deceptive, and illusory. So anicca bhikkhave kama tucca musa mosa dhammang in Pali. So it's illusory. It's the babble of fools. So both sensual pleasures and the perceptions we have about them in this life and in lives to come, the Buddha says they're part of Mara's realm, Mara's domain, Mara's bait, Mara's hunting ground. So unskilled mental states such as covetousness, ill will, and competition, they arise on account of these things. And so they obstruct us from the training, from developing the Noble Eightfold Path. They obstruct us from getting out of this dire predicament. So in the next part of this discourse, we're going to spend more time going through what that really means. But with that in mind, what we can say at this juncture is that the Buddha is telling Mahānāma and us that if we don't attain to the pleasure and rapture, the piti sukha in Pali, that is apart from sensual pleasures and apart from unwholesome states, or to more peaceful states, so that means the arupas, so the formless attainments, to the cessation of perception and feeling, so nirodha samapatti, or even to the liberation, then we'll still be attracted to sensual pleasures. And the Pali word is avati, and this has been translated as attracted to. So we're attracted to sensual pleasures, but it can also be translated as enticed, affected, seduced by, and even we turn to them. So we turn to sensual pleasures. So the Buddha is saying, if we don't attain to the higher concentration levels, then we are affected or enticed by sensual pleasures. Now, when we enter the first jhana, the reason why the Buddha says it temporarily makes us less affected by sensual pleasures is because we know that the 5 hindrances have been abandoned. So sensual desire kicks it off. Then we have ill will, dullness and drowsiness, restlessness and worry, and then the doubt. So if we do attain to the jhanas or the more peaceful states, the Buddha confirms we won't be affected or enticed by sensual pleasures. We won't even turn to them. And this applies whether we live a household life or as a renunciant. Therefore, we need to train in our sutta meditations because they activate the Noble Eightfold Path and they enable us to enter and remain in jhanas, which is right concentration. And there's relative safety there, even temporarily, from poison entering the mind. So this encouragement is to frequently enter and remain in these higher concentrations so we experience greater pleasure than what we find in sensual pleasures. So we remember from the Salayatana Vibhanga Sutta, the Buddha says to replace the pleasures of household life, so pleasures that we have from sensual pleasures, with the pleasures of the renunciation. So these are the jhanas and the higher peaceful states. And as we know from our own meditation, this is true. So then the Buddha goes on and confirms that he himself recognized and understood this directly while he was still an unenlightened bodhisattva. So he says, before my enlightenment, while I was still only an unenlightened bodhisattva, I too clearly saw, as it actually is with proper wisdom, how sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering, and much despair, and how great is the danger in them. But as long as I still did not attain to the rapture and pleasure that are apart from sensual pleasures, apart from the whole unwholesome states, or to something more peaceful than that, I recognized that I still could be attracted to sensual pleasures. But when I clearly saw it as it actually is with proper wisdom, how sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering, and so on, and I attained to the rapture and pleasure that are great, that are apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome state, or to something more peaceful than that, I recognized that I was no longer attracted to sensual pleasures. So the key thing here is to recognize the Buddha saw it for himself as the Bodhisattva. So he's not just making it up. He's not relying on somebody else. He's expressing his direct experience. So that's very important. So now the Buddha gives Mahānāma teaching on the gratification and dangers in sensual pleasures. So he explains step by step how they affect, trouble, and can poison the mind. And in truth, they do provide little gratification, much suffering, and much despair, and a lot of danger. The key attribute of household life, as we said at the start, is it's our proximity to sensual objects that is a problem. We end up pasturing, taking them up, turning to them, and thinking there is gratification in sensual pleasures. So the Buddha says, and what is the gratification in the case of sensual pleasures? And the Pali word here is asaddha, which has been translated as gratification, but it can also be translated as enjoyment or satisfaction. So the Buddha says, Mahānāma, there are these 5 chords of sensual pleasure. What are the 5? Forms cognizable by the eye that are wished for, desired, agreeable, and likable, connected with sensual desire and provocative of lust. And then sounds cognizable by the ear, and the same we wish for, desire, etc. Odors cognizable by the nose. Flavors cognizable by the tongue, tangibles cognizable by the body, which is also wished for, desired, agreeable, likable, connected with sensual desire and provocative of lust. These are the 5 chords of sensual pleasure. Now, the pleasure and joy that arise dependent on these 5 chords of sensual pleasure are the gratification in the case of sensual pleasures. What the Buddha is teaching us here is the gratification in sensual pleasures arises when we seek pleasure that is dependent on these 5 chords or objects of sensual pleasure. So these are the karma guna. And if you remember from the Nigaṇṭhas Sutta, this is Anguttara Nikāya, chapter 6, discourse number 63, the Buddha makes clear that these 5 chords of sensual pleasure are not sensual pleasures, but simply the objects of sensual pleasure. In the Nigaṇṭhas Sutta, the verse that the Buddha gives is Sankaparago Purisa Sakamo. So lustful or greedy intention is a person's sensual pleasure. Nete kama yani sitrani loket. The world's pretty things aren't sensual pleasures. Sankaparago Purisa Sakamo. Lustful intention is a person's sensual pleasure. And then, so he repeats that. And then he says, Titanti sitrani tateva loke. The world's pretty things stay just as they are. Ateta dira vinanyanti chandanti. So a wise one removes desire for those things. So this is very, very important, because what it's saying is it's our intentions, our thinking, our examining of agreeable objects. So when we think about sensual pleasures, that is the problem. It's not the objects themselves. Now, in the Cuḻadukkhakkhandha Sutta, it makes the same distinction between sensual objects, which in Pali is vatu karma, and sensual defilements, which is kiles karma. And the Karma Sutta, if we want to go into sensual objects, the Buddha says in Karma Sutta that it's the fields, our land, property, gold, our cattle, horses, helpers, servants, women, and relatives are sensual objects. And the sensual defilements are the lust, desire, lustful intentions, the greedy intentions, the delight, our craving, and of course, the hindrance of sensual desire. So this is what the Buddha is really emphasizing, is this internal state we haven't abandoned. And so whatever thoughts we have about sensual objects, we wish for them, we desire them, we find them agreeable, and we like them. So they're always connected with sensual desire. We covet, and they're provocative of lust. So the Pali words that the Buddha uses is itta, kanta, manapa, piyarupa, kamu, upasamahita, rajaniya. So this is very similar, to sum it up, in how we take delight, welcome or express, and remain holding. It's the same process, the abhinandati, abhiwadati, ajosaya titati. So some examples of that, when we go to a party and we see an attractive person and we think, oh, they look so beautiful or attractive, I'd really like to meet them. Or when we catch up with extended family and we think, oh, it's so good to see everyone, especially the little ones and my favorite uncles and aunties, and I wish we could do this more often. Or when we attend a concert and hear music and we think, oh, this is amazing. This show is fabulous. Next time they come to town, I want to book tickets. Or we go for a meal at a popular place, and having eaten their specialties, we think, oh, their food is so tasty and it's better than the other place we usually go to. Or I wonder whether they use cinnamon or nutmeg and in that dish, or let's come back next week. Or our partner brings us a fresh bouquet of flowers, and we think, oh, these flowers smell so divine, and I hope they buy me flowers next time. Or we've been gifted new bed linens for our birthday, and we try them out and we think, oh, the sheets are so soft, and I wonder what the thread count is, and I love their design and it's so on trend, and I wonder where I can buy more of their stuff. And it can also be similar things about ourselves, like what we think about our own appearance, the way we sound, or the way we play an instrument, or how well our cooking comes out, or the fragrances we apply and the texture of our skin, and things like that. In all these cases, we see how sensual pleasures come to arise. It's our lustful thoughts and intentions dependent on our eyes cognizing forms, ears cognizing sounds, nose cognizing odors, tongue cognizing taste, and body cognizing tactile sensations. Excuse me. What we don't see is the downside when we're imbued in sensual pleasures. We don't see aging, we don't see decay, we don't see the death-bound nature of sensual objects, nor do we see that we are living with greed. which is not the way out of suffering. It actually poisons the mind towards the wrong path. And this is what is binding us towards samsara. So the Buddha then explains to Mahānāma the danger in sensual pleasures, and he does this at length. The Pali here is kamanam adinavo. So adinavo or adinava is translated as danger, but it can also be drawback, disadvantage, consequence, or distress. And the Buddha says, and what bhikkhus is the danger in the case of sensual pleasures? Here, bhikkhus, on account of the craft, so the Pali word for this word is sipatana, which can also be translated as art or skill or branch of knowledge, by which a clansman makes a living, whether checking or accounting or calculating or farming or trading or husbandry or archery or the royal service or whatever craft it may be. So clearly at the time of the Buddha, these are the examples, but we know we have our modern examples. He has to face cold, he has to face heat, he is injured by contact with gadflies, mosquitoes, wind, sun, and creeping things. He risks death by hunger and thirst. Now, this is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a mass of suffering visible here and now, having sensual pleasures as its cause, sensual pleasures as its source, sensual pleasures as its basis, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. So this first danger is connected with using our skill or trade to work and earn a living. Initially, we can look at this from a worldly standpoint of the risks associated with working out in the open, so being subject to the elements, cold, heat, wind, etc. Being at risk of injury from insects, animals, people, vehicles, machinery, and so on. Even going to and from work is a risk, whether it's walking, cycling, traveling by public transport, or in one's own vehicle. There are accidents, collisions, all kinds of little things. And we're also at risk of work stress or work-related illnesses and conflicts. And we can also struggle at work with hunger and thirst and even having to take our meals at set times. And those are not to our liking and preference. But the important thing here is the Buddha's real interpretation, because it's more than just the mundane worldview of working and earning money, the risk of those things. If we come back to how we birthed this human body to experience pleasure in the world, which is we birthed into a sensual world, we clearly had lustful thoughts and greedy intentions. We had sensual pleasures at the forefront of our minds. So sensual pleasures is really the source, basis, and cause for having to face the cold, the heat, the wind, the insects, being attacked by animals, afflicted by hunger and thirst. If we didn't desire or crave sensual objects, then we would have been born into a Brahma world where we would have had a mind-made body instead of this kind of body. With a mind-made body, we wouldn't be afflicted by the cold or the heat or the wind. We wouldn't be afflicted by hunger or thirst and having to urinate and defecate. And we wouldn't have to go through painful feelings and suffer through experiencing all of these afflictions. Now, most people blame the elements. They blame the creatures. They blame the people or the afflictions that come as part of this life that cause pain and suffering. But it's really due to our greedy thoughts, our desire for sensual pleasures that caused all of this. So by living with greed, we experience all this pain and suffering. And so the question to really ask is, do we really want to do this again? So as the Buddha says, this is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a mass of suffering, apparent or visible in this present life. This is really caused by sensual pleasures. So take a few moments now, just a few moments to connect with this Dhamma. Just consider that, contemplate that, take that into your mind just for a few moments. So then the Buddha says next, if no property comes to the clansman while he works, strives, and makes an effort thus, he sorrows, grieves, and laments. He weeps, beating his breast, and becomes distraught, crying, my work is in vain, my effort is fruitless. Now, this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. Now, at a basic level, we need to work to sustain ourselves and what we consider as mine. Additionally, as pleasure seekers, we're conditioned to want more, to gain more, to follow worldly role models. The question when it comes to sensual desire is how much is enough? Unfortunately, if we covet, then it is never enough. So we work to earn money to gain more sensual pleasures. Here, the Buddha is really stating how hard we work, applying ourselves to whatever job or jobs we have. And in this instance, we don't earn enough money to afford property. The Pali word for property is bhoga, and it can be translated as property, but it's also material possessions and wealth. So bhoga refers to our physical or material property, and it is all the physical nutriment, so kablinkara hara. Now, when it comes to not earning enough money to afford property, we can think from our own set of circumstances and see whether this is true. Can we afford a house or a home? Can we afford a vehicle? Can we pay our weekly or monthly bills and other expenses? Can we afford to care for our families and the expenses they incur? Can we afford the material things we desire? The holidays, the gadgets, the concerts, the investments, whatever it is. Most people say that what they earn isn't enough to afford what they desire, let alone the costs of living. So their mortgage or rent, their utilities, transport, food, clothing, and so on. Many people are at this time working multiple jobs, not just one, and it's still not enough. And there's also uncertainties and cycles, as we already know from the recent shutdown and pandemic, and also natural disasters or economic challenges that come and impact the cost of living. So as a result, we experience sorrow, fatigue, we lament, we beat our breasts, as the Buddha says, wailing in confusion, saying, my work is in vain, my effort is fruitless. So basically, we can all attest at how stressful and painful it is to experience the sense of lack, despite working hard and striving. But we usually think it's somebody else's fault. So if you talk about these things, normally what comes up is we place blame on the government or the politicians. Maybe it's our employer's fault for not paying better salaries or wages. Maybe it's the global economy and what's happening with world powers. Maybe it's greedy corporations or elite families or climate change or even aliens or offshoring or even artificial intelligence taking away certain jobs. But whatever or whoever it is, where we're placing blame is usually external and tangible. But again, from the Buddha's perspective, we need to contemplate that we've birthed this body and we have to work in order to sustain this body and whatever we take as me and mine. And when we don't earn enough, despite our hard work and effort, we experience suffering. So it was our intention to come and birth such a body. So again, it's due to these lustful thoughts and greedy intentions. We are perpetually thinking about how to earn more money, how to acquire more, how to invest and earn more. And that is really the source or basis and cause for having little property despite working really hard. We live with greed, essentially. And so we experience this pain and suffering. So as the Buddha says, this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a massive suffering apparent in this life caused by sensual pleasures. So take another few moments just to think of your own example and connect with this Dhamma. Take it and turn it over in your mind. Next, the Buddha goes on to say, if property comes to the clansman while he works and strives and makes an effort thus, he experiences pain and grief in protecting it. How shall neither kings nor thieves make off with my property, nor fire burn it, nor water sweep it away, nor hateful heirs make off with it? And as he guards and protects his property, kings or thieves make off with it, or fire burns it, or water sweeps it away, or hateful heirs make off with it. And he sorrows, grieves, and laments. He weeps, beating his breast, and becomes distraught, crying, what I have, or what I had, I have no longer. Now, this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. So here the Buddha is now referring to if we are successful in gaining bhoga, our property, possessions, or wealth, and we experience pain and sadness because we have to protect it, guard it. In Pali, this is sotesang bhogana araka adhikaranang dukkhang domanasang. So we experience the pain and sadness. What the Buddha says here connects with other teachings. So there's one called the Bhoga Sutta. This is in Anguttara Nikaya. And there he says 5 dangers in property or wealth. What 5? It is shared by fire, water, kings, thieves, and displeasing heirs. So when we gain property or wealth, as we all know, we know how hard it is to work and earn to acquire these things. And our greatest fear is losing our property, our possessions, our wealth, even our loved ones. And so we're also afraid because when we live with greed, defilements arise in the mind. We think, how will I live if I lose these things? What will I need to do if I had to replace those things? Will I be able to sustain my current lifestyle? Will I have to give things up? Will I be able to fulfill my life plan for myself and my loved ones? How will I pay for my children's educations? How will I be able to look after myself in old age? Will there be enough for retirement and the lifestyle I want? So we expend a great deal of time and energy and expense to protect our property. Some examples include the very normal things like installing expensive security systems for our home or for our business, hiring security to patrol and secure our lands, having guard dogs on the property, or incentivizing people who work for us so that they don't leave, or hiring money managers to monitor and secure our investments, or taking actions at work, things that we find unpleasant, but we do in order so we don't lose our jobs or be at risk of losing our jobs. And we might diligently follow the share market every day to make sure we don't lose out on our share portfolio. Or we place our retirement assets with some fund manager who is reputable. Or it's even as simple as hiding or locking away our jewelry and important papers so they can't be easily stolen. And then you get other things like using offshore facilities to avoid tax, or securing the private keys for crypto assets or things like that. So we don't often consciously think about the pain and sadness associated with protecting our property or wealth because we don't think about the expense, we don't think about the stress, we don't think about the effort, we don't even think about how much we think about these things. It's not something that a renunciant who has ordained would have to think about. They've given up the bulk of what they were tied to. In our cases, householders, it's very different. And then what happens when we experience the loss of that property or wealth, or even the people in our lives? It's as the Buddha says, we lament and cry, what I have or what I had, I have no longer. Or another way of putting it is, what used to be mine, I've lost. And so isn't that what we all do? Our minds are full of stories of how we gained something. We held on to it for a while and then we lost it. And we took all those things as mine. And we tell others about that experience and we express our deep sorrow and sadness about those things. And then in turn, we hear the same kind of stories as well from others. And years after, we still hold on to those losses. So, for example, we might still be talking about the very good job or career that we lost for some reason or another. Or we talk about the share market crash and losing the bulk of our investments, or being swindled in a Ponzi scheme, or having our retirement savings stolen, or identity theft by something that's happened to our bank account, or even when it comes to the floods and fire or some other natural disaster, losing property, or when a family member comes and squanders wealth that has been in the family for a long time because maybe they're addicted to gambling, or maybe they're just terrible with money. And we also talk about when we're prosecuted by the government for failing to pay sufficient tax, or when a sibling or a friend stole something from the business that we had together, or the collapse of a crypto exchange and you held all your coins on that exchange. So we need to take our own examples and really investigate them, even something as simple as someone coming to our home and robbing us, and contemplating what the Buddha is really teaching us here. We can see that the mind gets very turbulent when it comes to what we take as me and mine, these sensual pleasures. We took that property or wealth or people as pleasing, so it's subha, attractive to us. We thought that it would last, so we have that idea of nicca. And we took these things as pleasurable, so we wanted sukha from these things, and we also took them as me and mine, so the atta kicks in. So all of this is really imbued with wrong view. The mind is then invaded with greed, hatred, and delusion. And you can see we talk about these things too, and we act on those things too. So as the Buddha says, this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a massive suffering apparent in this present life caused by sensual pleasures. So again, just take a few moments, maybe think about an example that resonates and connect with this Dhamma. So then the Buddha says, again, with sensual pleasures as the cause, sensual pleasures as the source, sensual pleasures as the basis, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. Kings quarrel with kings, nobles with nobles, Brahmins with Brahmins, householders with householders, mother quarrels with child, child with mother, father with child, child with father, brother quarrels with brother, brother with sister, sister with brother, friend with friend. And here in their quarrels, brawls, and disputes, they attack each other with fists, clods, sticks, or knives, whereby they incur death or deadly suffering. Now, this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. What the Buddha is highlighting here is all the arguments and conflicts we have with each other, within the family, at work, in the community, with friends, with the government, with other powers that be. They're all due to sensual pleasures. So some examples could be the dispute we have over wages or salaries at work, the argument we have with our sibling over each other's belongings or about inheritance, the quarrel we have with a friend over vacation plans, the brawl at a concert over a spilled drink, a fight at a sports event between fans on opposing sides, a disagreement between husband and wife over finances, a quarrel between parent and child over their choice of friends, a conflict in the community over whether to allow 5G towers, a fight that erupts during a home invasion and taking up a weapon to defend our family, a legal dispute between neighbors over a fence or a building extension, or a leadership dispute within a political party, or a difficult trade negotiation between countries. There is danger in all these conflicts and disputes, and there is always a risk of incurring death or deadly suffering, as the Buddha has said. We don't often think that can happen. But if you look in the news, you see domestic disputes resulting in fatality and people getting injured, or incidents at concerts or festivals resulting in fatalities, and many, many more. So if it is not fatal, then the result is suffering that is equivalent to death. So we really need to examine using our own examples, because we don't really often think that all these arguments with family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, that they're really due to sensual pleasures. But what is apparent is that they are, and what we've forgotten is that these sensual pleasures are impermanent, hollow, false, and deceptive. So anicca, tucca, musa Dhamma. Like sensual defilements arise when we forget this. So we can also connect this to another sutta that we've looked at before, which is the Cuḻadukkhakkhandha Sutta. So Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, discourse number 3. And if you remember Venerable Mahākachāna, he gives a very detailed explanation about one of the Buddha's verses. And the Buddha's verse is, having left home to roam without abode, in the village the sage is intimate with none. Rid of sensual pleasures without expectations, he would not engage people in dispute. So this is the verse that the Buddha talks about a sage, someone who is gone beyond many, many things. Now, in simple terms, unlike the sage living the household life, we are intimate in the village. So we associate with our communities, our families, and we're happy and sad depending on how they are. And we're not rid of sensual pleasures. So we have sensual defilements in our mind. We have lust, desire, affection, thirst, passion, craving for sensual pleasures. And we entertain expectations. So we wish for things in the future. And therefore we engage people in dispute. And they're all about these sensual pleasures. So as a result, like Mahanama was saying, our minds are invaded with the poison of greed, hatred, and delusion. Now, the Muni, the sage who renunciates these 4 things, does not allow these things to happen. So we need to train in that direction. So we did have a separate Poya Dhamma session on the Cuḻadukkhakkhandha Sutta. And it's very powerful because it helps us to identify how we get caught in Mara's realm, Mara's bait, all of that. And so, as the Buddha says, this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a mass of suffering apparent in this life caused by sensual pleasures. So again, just take a few moments to connect with this Dhamma. Just turn it over in your mind just for a few moments. The Buddha then says, again with sensual pleasures as the cause, men take swords and shields and buckle on bows and quivers, and they charge into battle massed in double array with arrows and spears, flying and swords flashing. And there they are wounded by arrows and spears, and their heads are cut off by swords, whereby they incur death or deadly suffering. Now, this too is a danger, or in the case of sensual pleasures, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. So here we find the previous quarrels and brawls and disputes have now escalated to charging into battle, armed to the hilt, with all kinds of weapons and strategies to win the battle. And on the battlefield, one will incur death or deadly suffering. So the examples that the Buddha gives here are for the time that the Buddha was around, but now we have other types of weapons, guns, and all kinds of different technologies and things. But the examples in this instance could be going to war for territory or land, and we see that happening today, or a civil war due to land and territory, or a battle between countries over sovereignty, or a battle between one group of countries and another group of countries over global power and ideals, or a clash within a country over racial inequality, or a battle between the government being military and people and its citizens over the economy, over the conditions. So the danger of large-scale conflicts, battles, and wars is getting wounded, death, or deadly suffering. And if you look at all these battles and wars, they're all due to sensual pleasures. So people, communities, countries, and rulers, they all fight over anything or everything. So as the Buddha says, this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a mass of suffering apparent in this life caused by sensual pleasures. So what we need to see here is when you really take things as me and mine, when you're really driven by lust and greed for sensual pleasures, then it gets to this scale of danger, this scale of suffering. So the Buddha then says, again, with sensual pleasures as the cause, men take swords and shields and buckle on bows and quivers, and they charge slippery bastions with arrows and spears flying and swords flashing. And there they are wounded by arrows and spears and splashed with boiling liquids and crushed under heavy weights, and their heads are cut off by swords, whereby they incur death or deadly suffering. Now, this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. So the Buddha here is giving more examples of being in battle or war and the danger of death and deadly suffering. So the examples are very much of that time. But if one has to fight such a battle, and usually when you read these two passages, you don't connect with it because maybe we don't belong to the military and have that kind of job. But if one has to really fight a battle and it's our job, we directly fight or support the fight, there's very real danger of getting injured and wounded and losing one's life and experiencing suffering equivalent to death. And also one may get extremely deluded with the wrong view because you believe all the superiors who are guiding you into battle as well. And they don't know right from wrong. They don't know about the misconduct of killing and harming beings. So we can't really fathom that, but it is very real for those who are in the military, working in the security forces, even medical teams associated with the military and so forth. And the karma, as we just said, the consequences for killing and harming others is very grave. And the pain of loss for loved ones is very real. So if you're family or friends with someone who fights in those battles and they're injured or they pass away, they're killed in battle or war, then the mass of suffering is immense. And for those in power, the politicians, the government officials, the ruling elites, the international bodies, those that make the decisions to go to war, to battle, it's very weighty for them. And on what basis are these battles and wars really being fought? For sensual pleasures. So land and territory falls under that. Gaining power and more prestige and all the trappings of that is part of that. And so this is why the Buddha emphasizes that this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a mass of suffering apparent in this present life caused by sensual pleasures. So then the Buddha says, again, with sensual pleasures as the cause, men break into houses, plunder wealth, commit burglary, ambush highways, seduce others' wives, and when they are caught, kings have many kinds of torture inflicted on them. The kings have them flogged with whips, beaten with cane, beaten with clubs. They have their hands cut off, their feet cut off, their hands and feet cut off, their ears cut off, their noses cut off, their ears and noses cut off. They have them subjected to the porridge pot, to the polished shell shave, to the Rahu's mouth, to the fiery wreath, to the flaming hand, to the blades of grass, to the bark dress, to the antelope, to the meat hooks, to the coins, to the lye pickling, to the pivoting pin, to the rolled up kaliath, and they have them splashed with boiling oil, and they have them thrown to be devoured by dogs, and they have them impaled alive on stakes, and they have their heads cut off with swords, whereby they incur death or deadly suffering. Now, this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. So the Buddha explains that these crimes, such as stealing and sexual misconduct, they take place due to greed. A thief or a criminal is not doing these things out of non-greed, are they? A thief or criminal covets sensual things that don't belong to them. And same for the criminal. They take what is not being given and often take it by force or subterfuge. And the interesting thing is we don't often think that we are guilty of any of these sorts of things, but it's good to investigate even as when we were children or growing up and associating with the wrong kinds of company, do we have examples? So if we think about it, maybe we stole money from our parents' wallet as a child, or maybe our friends really like shoplifting and we joined in high school or something. Or maybe we ran off without paying for a meal when we were still in high school, just thinking it would be for fun. Or we got on a bus and we didn't pay the fare and we ran off when the bus conductor asked us to pay. Or as grown-ups, maybe we've stolen inventory or supplies from our employer, or taken a bribe at work, or embezzled money from people's bank accounts, or broken into someone's home while they're away. I mean, I'm not saying anybody here does that, but these are just examples. Or committed adultery with someone who's married, or maxed out credit cards and loans, and now we're being prosecuted for payment. So the danger in all these cases, whether we've done these things or not, but definitely in all these different crimes, big or small, there is always punishment if one is caught. So the examples may not be as dire as what the Buddha has gone through, but if we were young, maybe we were told off or smacked or put in the naughty corner, or certain privileges were taken away. And later, if it was work-related, we might have lost our job or been fined or taken to court. Maybe we were imprisoned, maybe even beaten up. And there are other instances, as the Buddha has said, where it ends in death or deadly suffering. So whatever the case, we clearly experience pain and suffering due to sensual pleasures, due to our coveting of sensual pleasures and acting on it. So the list provided by the Buddha in this sutta is very extensive. And today in some countries, there's probably still some forms of those torture or punishment, but the common punishment for us now is to be convicted of a crime and serve time in prison, or having to pay a fine or damages or the equivalent if it's community service or something. So as the Buddha says, then this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a massive suffering apparent in this present life caused by sensual pleasures. So it's good to, in your own time, think of, really look into this, because I think with all these different instances that the Buddha is sequentially building up to, we don't really often see that sensual pleasures have risks. And also sometimes we're not so conscious of behaviors, what we think, what we say, and what we do. And so this is our way of really trying to connect with this Dhamma, to really see that when we think that there's gratification in sensual pleasures, then our behavior escalates knowingly or unknowingly. And then the last one that the Buddha says is, again, with sensual pleasures as the cause, sensual pleasures as the source, sensual pleasures as the basis, the cause being simply sensual pleasures, people indulge in misconduct of body, speech, and mind. Having done so, on the dissolution of the body after death, they reappear in states of deprivation, in an unhappy destination, in perdition, even in hell. Now, this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a massive suffering in the life to come, having sensual pleasures as its cause, sensual pleasures as its source, sensual pleasures as its basis, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. So as was said just before, the Buddha is really now summarizing all of his teaching on the danger in sensual pleasures, it all culminates in saying we undertake bodily, verbal, and mental misconduct because of sensual pleasures, misconduct rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. So this is what is keeping us bound to samsara. We remain quite greedy, quite hateful as a result, and very much deluded. So as we know, bodily misconduct is the killing of living beings, taking what is not given, also stealing, and sexual misconduct. The verbal misconduct is false speech or lying, harsh speech, divisive speech, frivolous talk. Really, with verbal misconduct, we glorify sensual pleasures and we derogate nibbana is really what we do. And when it comes to mental misconduct, of course, it's the covetousness, always thinking, let those things be mine, let me have them, ill will, and then wrong view. So the Buddha, having special knowledge of karma and rebirth, he could see the past lives, he could see about lives to come. He confirms that with the breakup of the body after death, misconduct results in rebirth in unhappy destinations. So there's many suttas that we've been through before about the result of misconduct. And Vyasana Sutta is one. So having the misfortune of having misconduct or the wrong view, that leads to rebirth in lower realms. Or Sansapaniya Sutta, the Buddha's exposition on creeping, where if we creep along by body, speech, and mind, then our bodily karma is crooked, our verbal karma is crooked, our mental karma is crooked, and therefore our destination and rebirth is crooked. And so in that particular example, that sutta, he says, what we can expect is exclusively painful hells or the species of creeping animals. And of course, we have the Duccharita Vipaka Sutta is another example. So this is where the Buddha gives the results of each of the misconduct or bad actions. So again, we need to connect the dots back to sensual pleasures. We cannot afford to have misconduct because if we wish to develop the Noble Eightfold Path, we actually need to cultivate virtuous conduct that is rooted in non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, meaning we refrain from all these misconducts. And this is also why the Buddha says this too is the danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a massive suffering caused by sensual pleasures. So that's the last part of the danger in sensual pleasures. Before we move on to the Buddha's encounter with the Nigaṇṭhas, it's probably a good opportunity to briefly look at the trainee's mode of progress to see what the Buddha had actually encouraged. And this particular teaching, the Sekha-patipada Sutta, was a teaching given to lay people because it was to the Sakyans and Mahanama was there. So in this particular teaching so far, the Cuḻadukkhakkhandha Sutta, we have realized how important it is to really understand the gratification and danger in sensual pleasures and to really see that it's sensual defilements that arise in the mind that's a problem, not the sensual objects themselves. So we've seen that the Buddha's detailed teaching on sensual pleasures, it highlights the different attributes of household life, but essentially it's our proximity to sensuality that can poison the mind. So we must remember this, that he's emphasized the importance of seclusion from sensual pleasures and unwholesome states to attain to the jhanas and the more peaceful states. So this means understanding the Buddha's teaching on the Four Noble Truths, seeing our predicament of birth leading to aging, sickness, and death, and the whole mass of suffering. So we need to continuously make effort towards developing the Noble Eightfold Path. Living the household life, it's not easy because it's not easy in the context of trying to develop a spiritual life. As the Buddha has set out, it's better to renunciate household life and ordain, but that's not possible for everyone. And when you think about those who are able to ordain, then they're supremely fortunate. And given the declining conditions in the world, they also must have a very strong intention towards fully developing the Noble Eightfold Path towards Nibbana. Otherwise, they will fall back to sensual pleasures and become defeated in the spiritual quest. Now, what is possible for householders or lay practitioners is to develop the Noble Eightfold Path and to make gradual spiritual progress. But what we need to do is heed the advice given by the Buddha and the Noble Arahants. So this teaching in Sekha-patipada Sutta is one of those things. It's about the trainee's mode of progress. And here the Buddha asked Venerable Ananda to explain to Mahānāma the Sakyans about the importance of 15 accomplishments in conduct and understanding. So that's what is on the right here. And what he's actually said, Venerable Ananda, is when a disciple is consummate in virtue, guards the doors to the sense faculties, eats in moderation, and is dedicated to wakefulness, and then they have 7 good qualities. So these 7 good qualities are conviction, moral shame, fear of wrongdoing, having heard much or very learned, energetic, mindful, and wise. And they get the 4 jhanas, blissful meditations in the present life that belong to the higher concentrations of mind. When they want, without trouble or difficulty, then one is called a disciple of the noble ones who follows the trainee's mode of progress. So the encouragement here is to become accomplished in conduct and knowledge. We know these things are beneficial and help us to become less affected by sensual pleasures. And most importantly, it aids us towards the goal of Nibbana. So just as an example, when we're consummate in virtue, we're very careful where we pasture. When we guard the doors to the sense faculties, we don't want to be enticed by sensual pleasures. We make sure we're safe or relatively safe. And this helps towards even being able to develop the jhanas because there's less in our minds that needs to be purified. Moderation in eating, so we eat only what is needed for the body. We don't indulge and eat with greed. Wakefulness, so we don't allow the hindrances to be there. We keep practicing with right effort. And then all these other good qualities, they help us to keep in check. They help us in terms of the spiritual faculties and powers and the other bodhipakya dhammas. And of course, as the Buddha, and in this case, Venerable Ananda has said, we train in particularly sutta meditations to make sure that we can get to the jhanas without trouble or difficulty. So the next part of the discourse, or the last part of the discourse, is really around how Buddha shares with Mahānāma his encounter with some of the Nigaṇṭhas. So he says, now Mahānāma, on one occasion I was living at Rajagaha on the mountain Vulture Peak. On that occasion, a number of Nigaṇṭhas living on the Black Rock on the slopes of Isagili were practicing continuous standing, rejecting seats, and were experiencing painful, racking, piercing feelings due to exertion. Then, when it was evening, I rose from meditation and went to the Nigaṇṭhas there. I asked them, friends, why do you practice continuous standing, rejecting seats, and experience painful, racking, piercing feelings due to the exertion? When this was said, they replied, friend, the Nigaṇṭha Buddha is omniscient and all-seeing and claims to have complete knowledge and vision thus. Whether I am walking or standing or sleep or awake, knowledge and vision are continuously and uninterruptedly present to me. He says thus, Nigaṇṭhas, you have done evil actions in the past. Exhaust them with the performance of piercing austerity. And when you are here and now, restrained in body, speech, and mind, that is doing no evil actions for the future. So by annihilating with asceticism past actions and by doing no fresh actions, there will be no consequence in the future. With no consequence in the future, there is the destruction of action. With the destruction of action, there is the destruction of suffering. With the destruction of suffering, there is the destruction of feeling. With the destruction of feeling, all suffering will be exhausted. This is the doctrine we approve of and accept, and we are satisfied with it. So the Nigaṇṭhas are confirming their confidence in their teacher, Nigaṇṭha Buddha, and they follow his doctrine that all suffering will be exhausted by performing piercing austerities and ascetic practices. And this is why they were continuously standing and experiencing all the pain and piercing feelings. Now, the Buddha questions them on this particular doctrine, and he says, when this was said, I told them, but friends, do you know that you existed in the past and that it is not the case that you did not exist? And they answer, no, friend. And then the Buddha says, but friends, do you know that you did evil actions in the past and did not abstain from them? And they answer, no, friend. And then the Buddha asks, but friends, do you know that you did such and such evil actions? And they reply, no, friend. And so the Buddha says, but friend, do you know that so much suffering has already been exhausted, or that so much suffering has still to be exhausted? And that when so much suffering has been exhausted, all suffering will have been exhausted. And they again reply, no, friend. And then he asks, but friends, do you know what the abandoning of unwholesome states is and what the cultivation of wholesome states is here and now? So this is referring to whether they have the right view. And they answer again, no, friend. And then he says, so friends, it seems that you do not know that you existed in the past, and that it is not the case that you did not exist, or that you did evil actions in the past and did not abstain from them, or that you did such and such evil actions, or that so much suffering has been exhausted, or that so much suffering has still to be exhausted, or that when so much suffering has been exhausted, all suffering will have been exhausted, or what the abandoning of unwholesome states is and what the cultivation of wholesome states is here and now. That being so, those who are murderers, bloody-handed evil doers in the world, when they are reborn among human beings, go forth into homelessness as Nigaṇṭhas. So when the Buddha has posed these questions to the Nigaṇṭhas regarding their doctrine and belief and the things that have led them to be austere and have ascetic practices, their answers indicate that they don't know or they don't have any direct insight to support what they're practicing. They don't have the right view about what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. So they won't know, in terms of, say, the Buddha's teaching, what leads to the cessation of suffering, like the real way that leads to the cessation of suffering, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. So they don't know about the path of non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, because if they did, then they wouldn't be practicing the austerities and ascetic practices. They wouldn't think that they needed to do that and make such an exertion. So as the Buddha says, if that was the way to overcome evil action by bad karma, by performing austerities and ascetic practices, then all murderers and evildoers in the world, when they're reborn as humans, they would go forth into homelessness as Nigaṇṭhas. If only it were that simple. It's not. So that's part of what the Buddha is saying there. And then the Nigaṇṭhas respond to the Buddha by saying, friend Gautama, pleasure is not to be gained through pleasure. Pleasure is to be gained through pain. For were pleasure to be gained through pleasure, then King Senya Bimbisara of Magadha would gain pleasure, since he abides in greater pleasure than the Venerable Gautama. So the Nigaṇṭhas believe that Nibbana, like ultimate happiness, is gained through pain. And they use the example of King Bimbisara to make their point, saying that he has all the essential pleasures and it's more than the Buddha. And basically, the king abides in greater pleasure than the Buddha. So, and their argument is really around sensual pleasures. However, the Buddha has taught that Nibbana is gained through pleasure, but not sensual pleasures. It's the pleasure of renunciation. So that means seclusion from sensual pleasures, unwholesome states, attaining to the mental absorptions or jhanas, or more peaceful states. So we confirm this in the Salayatana Vibhanga Sutta, that one replaces household pleasure with renunciant pleasure. And the Buddha responds to the Nigaṇṭhas by correcting their statement. He says, surely the Venerable Nigaṇṭhas have uttered these words rashly or without reflection. Rather, it is I who ought to be asked, who abides in greater pleasure, King Senya Bimbisara of Magadha or Venerable Gautama? And the Nigaṇṭhas respond, surely, friend Gautama, we uttered those words rashly and without reflection, but let that be. Now we ask the Venerable Gautama, who abides in greater pleasure, King Senya Bimbisara of Magadha or the Venerable Gautama? And the Buddha then says, then, friends, I shall ask you a question in return. Answer it as you like. What do you think, friends? Can King Senya Bimbisara of Magadha abide without moving his body or tittering a word, experiencing the peak of pleasure for 7 days and nights? And the Nigaṇṭhas answer, no, friend. And so the Buddha says, can King Senya Bimbisara of Magadha abide without moving his body or uttering a word, experiencing the peak of pleasure for 6, 5, 4, 3, or 2 days or nights, for 1 day or night? And of course, they answer no, friend. So they cannot abide without moving the body or uttering a word. And what we really realize with this is that when we can't do that, we endure great pain or suffering to try and stay, to even make effort to stay without moving or speaking. In the king's case, he would clearly not be able to last very long because the pleasure that he gains is through sensual pleasures. And we know from our own experience, even whatever little experience or great experience that we have, how difficult it is to attain to the jhanas, but it is what helps us in order to not be afflicted in the body nor afflicted in the mind if we get to the jhanas or the formless attainments or even the liberations or even the cessation of perception and feeling. The king doesn't have that ability, but the Buddha does. So the Buddha can attain the 4 jhanas whenever he wants without trouble or difficulty. He can attain to the higher, the peaceful states. And so this is how he can abide without moving his body or speaking a word, experiencing pleasure. The Buddha confirms it by saying, but friends, I can abide without moving my body or uttering a word, experiencing the peak of pleasure for 1 day and night, for 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 days and nights, for 7 days and nights. What do you think, friend? That being so, who dwells in greater pleasure, King Senya Bimbisara of Magadha or I? And that being so, the Venerable Gautama abides in greater pleasure than King Senya Bimbisara of Magadha. This is what the Blessed One said. Mahānāma the Sakyan was satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. So it's also really good for us to consider whether we can temporarily abide, as the Buddha does, without moving our body or speaking, and also what is obstructing us from doing so. So as this discourse has shown us, there's many obstructions. So for example, we have all kinds of things in household life about our families and work and various other things that prevent us literally from getting to sit down and meditate. And even when we sit and meditate, we usually have time constraints because of work or other obligations and responsibilities, or even sensual defilements entering our mind, invading our mind. So we're affected by sensual pleasures all the time. So it's not easy. And when you think about the mundane person who doesn't have the ability to know the Buddha's teaching, to know how to develop the Noble Eightfold Path, then you can really see that they can't sit still, they have to speak. And this is what the Buddha is actually pointing to. So with conviction and wisdom, we can actually reprioritize and make effort towards the Buddha's path. And with the Buddha's encounter with the Nigaṇṭhas, the Buddha is also showing Mahānāma the distinction between the pleasure we seek from sensual pleasures, that is flawed, and the greater pleasure of the jhanas and the more peaceful states, which is part of our trainees' mode of progress. And this is what enables us to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. It's not Nibbana, but it is leaning towards Nibbana and enabling us towards Nibbana. So great care needs to be taken when we live the household life, because the characteristics or attributes of household life, they put us in close proximity with sensual things. And these are the things that can poison the mind. So if we're really honest, the Buddha is right. It's only when we've entered the jhanas or formless attainments or other peaceful states that we're truly unaffected by sensual pleasures. This is why we train in the sutta meditations. Until then, we remain afflicted, troubled, and enticed by sensual pleasures. And we're still very much dependent on sensual pleasures outside of our meditation. So we only have to look at how much time we spend thinking about money, employment, our career, relatives, the people that work for us or work with us, our assets, our investments, all the disputes along the way, and how we've taken them as me and mine. And so all we talk about, if you really examine what we talk about karma, sensual pleasures all the time. And well, maybe not all the time, because we do talk about Dhamma as well. So right now we're not really imbued, but you get what I mean. So when we talk about that, it becomes the priority of what we think about, what we talk about, and then what we spend time on. All of this is really, we're imbued with greed, hatred, and delusion. So you can see why it invades the mind and remains. So if we continue to allow this to happen without realizing the real danger, then we're bound for more of the same. We may have a little wisdom from our practice, but if we get caught up in the aspects of household life that are imbued with sensuality, then we keep falling for sensual pleasures, sensual defilements, the physical nutriment. So we haven't clued in to all the things that the Buddha has outlined in this discourse that are dangerous about sensual pleasures. And then at the same time, where we forget maybe, or it's not apparent in each moment that we're subject to old age, sickness, and death, that this predicament is a bad deal. It's a dire predicament. So what do we know about the physical nutriment? So this is the first unprofitable direction here. And we know there are 4 nutriments. So the first is physical nutriment, contact as nutriment, mental volition as nutriment, and conscious as nutriment. They all go these wrong ways. So in respect of the physical nutriment, we take the physical nutriment as subha, so we find it attractive or pleasing. And this is already a mental corruption, because if this escalates, we go the wrong way through desire. And this is the escalation of falling for sensual pleasures. And this is not what we want to do. This is the unprofitable direction. So what this really means is, at the point of death, with the breakup of this body, we might think, I need another eye in order to enjoy sensual pleasures, another ear, another nose, another tongue. I need the whole body to experience sensual pleasures. If this is the case, then we've misapprehended the physical nutriment. We're not seeing the physical nutriment as it really is. So when we take it that way, we think we can make it last. We think that there is pleasure, the post-perception of karmasava, this taint of sensual desires. We think that there's sukha from it. And so then we think, it's worth taking as me and mine. So all the vipalasas kick in. That's what we're really saying. This is the wrong view. So as a consequence of that, going the wrong way through desire means we would come back to another mother's womb thinking, there's some enjoyment in sensual pleasures, this physical nutriment, when really the Buddha has said throughout this whole discourse in this Cuḻadukkhakkhandha Sutta is, sensual pleasures are really providing very little gratification. They're much suffering, bahu dukkha, and much despair, bahu upayasa. And so there's great danger in them. So if you really think about it, we've roamed and wandered in samsara, which has no discoverable beginning, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. And countless times we've gone from womb to womb, and not always to a human birth. Like the session that we have done on precious human birth, Cūḷadukkhakkhandha Suttas, the Buddha says a human birth is difficult to gain, it's rare. And in the chapter of abbreviated texts, which is associated with chapter 56 of Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha says those beings who die as humans and are reborn as humans or devas are few. So it becomes really vital that we really heed the Buddha's words to Mahānāma in this sutta, and to contemplate each instance of danger in sensual pleasures. It's a very valuable teaching for us, because even if we've only understood part of it, it would make us more purposeful and careful in living this household life. So we would do things more consciously. We would associate with good friends who make an effort towards the spiritual life. We would listen to the Buddha's words with eager ears and contemplate this Dhamma. We would be more diligent in our conduct and where we pasture and spend our time. We would apply sense restraint, moderation in eating, wakefulness. We would actively purify the mind of defilements. We would train in good qualities. We would develop these sutta meditations and become very proficient at getting to the higher concentrations. And we would have a very strong determination towards the Noble Eightfold Path as the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Now, the advanced view of this is really that if we truly see the loathsomeness or the patikula of sensual pleasures, see that ultimately they never give us what we want because they don't last, they decay, they are really dukkha rather than sukha, and that they're not worth taking as me and mine. So we always end up in the pain and sadness of sensual pleasures. Then we go towards what is not loathsome, so apatikula, which is really nibbana. Nibbana is the only thing that will offer us true safety and supreme happiness. So we would genuinely train ourselves to nabi nandati, nabi vadati, najosayatitati, not take delight, not welcome, and not remain holding. And that applies to sensual pleasures and the physical nutriment. But in our entire spiritual life, it's about all these nutriments: physical, contact, mental volition, and consciousness, all of it. So let's close with this discourse from the chapter of 8 in the Sutta Nipata on the drawback of sensual pleasures. And these are the Buddha's verses. When a mortal desires sensual pleasures, if that succeeds for him, surely he is elated in mind, having gained what he desires. But when, full of sensual desire, a person is aroused by desire, if those sensual pleasures decline, he is afflicted as if pierced by a dart. One who avoids sensual pleasures, like a serpent's head, with the foot, being mindful, overcomes this attachment to the world. Fields, land, or bullion, cattle and horses, slaves and servants, women, relatives. When a person greedily longs for various sensual pleasures, even the weak overpower him, obstacles crush him, then suffering enters him as water does a broken boat. Therefore, ever mindful, a person should avoid sensual pleasures. Having abandoned them, one can cross the flood, as by bailing out of the boat, one can reach the far shore.